engines that were really practical came, in my opinion, from a company called Palmer Brothers in 1895. Actually, they built their first engine in 1893, 94. The Palmer were on the Miami River. They were in the telephone manufacturing business, and they liked to row in their boat on the Miami River, which was right by their factory, because they had a water wheel which drove the factory. And then they got the idea they'd like to have an engine in their boat, and they looked at various engines which were available. And they all failed on their ignition systems or their carburetors for mixing air and fuel. Spark, where he had a contactor which inside the cylinder was closed at the right point in the rotation of the engine crankshaft, and it would make a quick snap and draw out a nice arc. It wasn't a spark, it was an arc just like an arc welder has, except of course it was very small. And it was a very simple system. By 1900 they were making them in a horse and a half, 3 horse, 5 horse. And they were so successful that by 1903 or 4 they gave up the telephone business, where they had made a great deal of money. They also found that their neighbors would buy engines if they would put them in a boat, so they also built a huge boat building operation and were shipping boats with engines all over the country and even abroad. I got my first antique marine engine in 1935. It came from the estate of the man who started American Railway Express. I still have it. The engine was called a Lackawanna, a horse and a half, a direct reversing 2-stroke. And I just loved that engine and ran it when I was much younger. And when I came back from after World War II, and then I went back to Europe for a while, I came back and got a job in Washington. I was living on the Severn River, and in the late 50s, the watermen were still using these big old one-lungers for crabbing and oystering. And every little cove would have half a dozen of these antiques, all beached and rusting and so on. Some of them were really still operable. The owners would just dump them in these coves to get rid of them. And so my 2 sons and myself would go around and we'd gather up various parts from various engines and put them back together. And we just started from there. I trade for engines I want rather than buy them. I've got one you want, and you've got one I want. I would like to show you the typical battery box the old-timers would use. Their ignition systems were their number one problem if they got wet with salt water. Now, normally this would be hooked up to the various parts of the engine, and come the end of the day, the waterman would disconnect it, take it home, put it by the fire or the kitchen stove to dry it out, so that next morning when he goes back down to his boat, the ignition system goes back with him. Now I'm going to prime the engine to make it easier to start. So I put about a teaspoon of gasoline in there, close that up. Now it's ready to start. To start, I have to retard the spark a little bit, retard the valves. I'm going to have my friend pull the engine through to start.